For delicious meals, you could go out to eat, or you could just make a Marie Callender's meal. Marie Callender's classic chicken parmigiana bowl is so good, it has marinara sauce that's made from scratch and creamy mozzarella cheese over pasta. It's delicious with no artificial flavors, colors, or preservatives and 30 grams of protein. You can find it in the frozen aisle. Marie Callender's, what having it all tastes like.
What were the realities of rearmament in the 1930s for Great Britain? The shadow of the Great War shaped a generation of beliefs, values, and attitudes amongst the population. There's no mistake about that. And they also shaped the country's politics. But by the mid to late 1930s, a growing body of opinion believed that rearmament was essential and that a further war with Germany was going to be largely unavoidable. And in this podcast, we're going to explore the pressures on the national government in trying to navigate this incredibly difficult political minefield. So welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And this episode, it kind of follows a little bit from the last one that I was doing on the Battle of Britain, the Dowding system, and the difficulties that the Luftwaffe actually had, the organizational difficulties and the British overestimation of German strength and the German underestimation of British preparedness. So today, we're going to look at Britain's War by Daniel Todman, Volume 1, Into Battle, 1937 to 1941. And here we are exploring the interwar period as it relates to rearmament and the limited options that Baldwin, the Prime Minister, had, and that led Chamberlain after him. So we previously, when we looked at this book, it's ages ago now, we looked at the various debates that were held behind closed doors for the most part during the kind of era about 1934, 1935, and the kind of the endless rounds of kind of introspective negotiating and the indecision and the lack of urgency that seemed to be that seemed to kind of prevail. Obviously, this period we are kind of emerging from the Great Depression. The Great Depression probably begins to alleviate mainly in Britain in about 1935. It's much more pronounced, much longer in America. And so spending decisions were coloured by that, and also by the austerity which the government had inflicted upon itself. But they were also coloured by the fact that it was politically very, very dangerous to engage in rearmament, partly because of memories of the First World War, and also the belief there had been arms races that had led to the crisis in 1914. So, Daniel Todman writes, the lack of urgency in these discussions might have delayed the start of rearmament, but it did not necessarily leave Britain less well prepared for the conflict that eventually developed in 1939. In the aircraft industry, the key concern for politicians living under the shadow of the bomber, the issue impeding production for the moment was not a shortage of labour, finance, or official direction, but rather the need to adapt to a period of dramatic change in aircraft design, as the fabric-covered, open cockpit biplanes of an earlier era gave way to a new generation of enclosed monoplanes, metal-skinned, tubular strutted, and capable of dramatically improved performance. These aircraft required not only new skills and new assembly lines for their manufacture, but also, since they were being pressed into development more quickly, more modifications and concomitant delays as they moved from prototypes into mass production. This was the reason that the deliveries of the most modern aircraft ordered during 1936 were initially so disappointing. This was a problem that would only be solved by the accumulation of industrial experience. Throwing a Chilean supply supremo into the mix would probably have generated more confusion than progress. Quite aside from its possible economic consequences, an all-out program of military expansion in the mid-1930s would have lumbered Britain with a fleet of immediately out-of-dated aircraft. Since Churchill's predictions of an imminent attack proved wrong, Britain's cautious start to rearmament actually left it better prepared than it would otherwise have been for the war that actually began at the end of the decade. These debates around coordination, direction, and control of military supplies would rumble on throughout the years that followed. They got to the heart of the dilemma facing democratic politicians in the second half of the 1930s. How far should they subordinate freedom and prosperity to security? It was typical of the age of these debates. It was typical of the age that these debates focused on military technology, the profit motive, and the role of the state. Yet they also developed into a thoroughfare for political ambition in the era of total war. The man who controlled munitions production would exert unparalleled powers over national life. And that itself is telling. So when we talk about the era of total war, this is an era that begins in 1914, and as A.J.P. Taylor points out in his History of England, 1914 to 1945, there had been no prior precedent to total war and its transformation of society, its transformation of the role and the place of the citizen and the state, and the role of the state in industry, in coordinating industry towards this war, this effort of total victory. And the fact that we're talking about wars of national survival. And when you're at that point, it brings about essentially revolutionary transformations in society. The world at the end of the Second World War bears little resemblance to the world. I mean, obviously, there's technological change and that kind of thing. But the world of 1914, the kind of the liberalism's last summer, um, and the power of the state to coordinate all resources to total victory leads to obviously the curtailment of certain individual liberties, as things like mass conscription emerged from 1916 onwards. The proliferation of Britain's potential maritime opponents, the belated start to naval rearmament, and the furore over the threat from the air all meanwhile had implications for the defence of the Far East. The launch of powerful new German commerce raiders, armed merchant vessels, and the risk of a war with Italy in the Mediterranean both required the Royal Navy to commit its capital ships to European waters. Though the Admiralty was now embarking on a major new programme of construction, battleships and aircraft carriers took time to build. Older ships were taken out of action as they were refitted to bring them up to date. Yet the commitment to send a fleet to Singapore in the event of hostilities with Japan remained the centrepiece of defence planning in the Far East. There's a huge amount written about this by my favourite historians of the war in the Far East, Harper and Bailey, particularly that the Singapore strategy, which in some ways was it attempted to kind of address Australian security concerns, not very successfully, because it was believed that Singapore would be within striking distance of Australia if a Japanese fleet sails southwards to attack there. But also, the Singapore would be the staging post for the blockade of the Japanese home islands, and of course, at Singapore, the guns, the large new naval base that was built there, and the military installations and naval guns all pointed outwards, and of course, Japanese General Yamashita came by land down the Malay Peninsula. And when Singapore actually falls, which David Edgerton says that this is a kind of a fundamental moment in in sort of the end of Britain as a world power, the fall of Singapore. It's kind of an epic humiliation, partly due to the kind of the weakness of Percival, the general in charge, who had numerous options to perhaps defeat the far less kind of well prepared and far less numerous Japanese force than he'd imagined, and Singapore is lost without the kind of fight that sort of Churchill is hoping for. Churchill, of course, sends the repulse on the Prince of Wales out to kind of deter Japan, and these are both sunk off the coast of Malaysia, or Malaya at the time.
When it comes to what your family eats and drinks, you know your choices matter. You're the expert because you know what fits your life. And getting it right starts with good information. That's why America's beverage companies are sharing more information about our ingredients at goodtoknowfacts.org. No spin, no judgments, just the facts straight from the experts for more than 140 beverage ingredients. Visit goodtoknowfacts.org.
So the Singapore strategy is a huge part of Britain's imperial defence, and it fails miserably. As the base at Singapore approached completion, the gap between commitments and resources was reflected in the drawing out of the period before relief, at the time that it was expected to take to assemble and dispatch a fleet, and for it to then reach Singapore, from 6 weeks to 70 days in 1937. Privately, the Admiralty already thought that 6 months would be more likely. In that length of time, a Japanese attack might do serious damage to the British Empire. As the period before relief elongated over the final years of the 1930s, the governments of Australia and New Zealand repeatedly sought confirmation from the British that they intended to live up to their promises to defend the empire. As they prioritised the more immediate dangers in Europe, the British authorities became increasingly slippery about how they expressed their determination. Everyone concerned studiously avoided the sort of showdown that might have exposed the redundancy of the Singapore strategy. The British did not want an argument that would threaten Commonwealth unity, not least because Canada and South Africa did not share the same defence priorities as the Pacific Dominions. The Australians and New Zealanders wanted to stick with their existing new defence plans, which did not include bearing the full financial burden of protecting themselves against Japan. No one wanted to make a public admission of imperial weakness that would only encourage the Germans, Italians, and Japanese. Meanwhile, plans for the defence of Singapore were overhauled. Originally, the naval base had been defended only against an attack from the sea, since the Malayan Peninsula was presumed to be effectively impassable. Since the 1920s, however, the economic development of Malaya had resulted in a good network of roads and ports. Not only would the fleet take longer to arrive, but the base was now exposed to an attack from the north. From the late 1920s, the RAF, ever keen to demonstrate the importance of an independent air force, had angled to take over the strategic burden in the Far East. In 1936, the Chiefs of Staff agreed that the Air Force should assume responsibility for the immediate defence of the Far Eastern Theatre, although still with the aim of protecting Singapore as a base for the fleet. And the RAF started working on constructing the airfields in Malaya, from which British planes were meant to dominate the surrounding area. By now, however, its main focus was on building up its strength in the UK rather than the Empire. Just as with the naval base, the British built facilities for a future war and hoped they could find the forces to fight it. So here we look at the kind of the realities of imperial overstretch. One of the demographic points I think is worth pointing out is that a lot of the people who are left defending Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and then India as well, are the ones that either survived the First World War or who didn't fight it, either too young. And one kind of trench thesis that is quite compelling is that a huge generation of future imperial talent, the soldiers and administrators that would normally, had there not been a war, have found very attractive jobs across India and across the Crescent, from Malaya, from Burma down to Malaya, all died in the trenches. And so you get who's left, and who's left is not great. The kind of least competent, least kind of mentally curious, intellectually curious, and least sort of diligent examples of kind of imperial soldiering and administration wind up kind of occupying the plantations of Malaya and the hill forts in India and Burma, with a senga with a nice whiskey soda. And these are the people who are defending, and also there's not a lot of them. The actual garrisoning of Malaya is pretty sparse. But there are not a lot of them are not the highest quality, highest caliber, and they are in the defence of Malaya and Singapore and Burma when the Japanese strike. The new airfields were built without reference to the army, but they had important implications for the soldiers who would have to fight for Malaya on the ground. If the airfields could not be protected, then an invader would be gifted positions from which to control the skies. To make the most of aircraft range, some of these airfields were in the north of Malaya. in order to protect them and to guard them against the risk of being outflanked by an invasion further south, the army would have to defend the whole peninsula at the same time. The only way to make the new strategy for defending Singapore work was through massive reinforcements of planes and soldiers. As the European crisis remained unresolved, the defence of the Far East became even more a matter of bluff. And again, here we look at the realities of imperial overstretch. So the British don't really have the manpower. The manpower in Asia comes from India and from the Indian Army. And the Indian Army and the Australians in Malaya are called on significantly to fight for the defence of the peninsula.
Confronting high credit card debt can feel scary. But the good news is, if you owe $10,000 or more in credit card debt, financial relief options are now available. National Debt Relief is currently offering debt relief designed to reduce what you owe, fast-tracking your way to being debt-free. If you qualify for debt relief, you may be able to pay back significantly less than what you owe and save thousands of dollars. Imagine only paying one low monthly program payment you can afford and saving money as you become debt-free. National Debt Relief has already helped bring debt relief to over 550,000 U.S. consumers, earning thousands of five-star reviews and an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau. You're stronger than your credit card debt. Take the first step and visit nationaldebtrelief.com to see what debt relief you qualify for. That's nationaldebtrelief.com.
In the Middle East, meanwhile, the rise of tensions with Italy had made the British increasingly concerned to protect their position in case of a future war. Although Britain had formally granted Egypt its independence in 1922, the British maintained a substantial military garrison in the country. This enabled them to protect the Suez Canal, but it was also one of the means by which the British could influence Egyptian politics. Egypt was notionally a constitutional monarchy, and politics between the wars had been a three-way struggle between the king, the British, and the Wafd, a well-organised nationalist party which usually did well at the ballot box. Since the Egyptians had never accepted the terms on which they had been granted independence, the British military occupation remained without legal basis. During the first half of 1936, however, the threat from Italy made both the Egyptian nationalist government and the British eager to come to an agreement that would bolster their security. On the 22nd of August, they signed a 20-year treaty that gave Egypt more control of its own armed forces and eliminated the extraterritorial privileges previously enjoyed by Europeans in Egypt. In turn, the British kept their military bases close to the canal and accepted a limitation of the garrison to a maximum of 10,000 troops. That limitation only increased the strategic importance to Britain of Palestine, which had been mandated to the UK by the League of Nations in 1922, and which would provide a crucial assembly point for imperial troops in the event of a European war. Yet in Palestine, the British were now facing the consequences of conflicting promises they'd made to Arab and Jewish nationalists at the height of the Great War. Under the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a white paper of 1922, and the terms of the League of Nations mandate, the British were committed to facilitating a Jewish immigration and the creation of a Jewish national home. In Britain, there was substantial political support for Zionism, which was seen as a means to further Palestine's economic development and secure the position of the British Empire. The same documents, however, also bound the British to protect the rights of the existing Palestinian population, the majority of whom were Arab, and to develop representative government within the mandate. During the 1920s, Palestinian Arabs began to organise themselves politically for the first time. In London, proposals for greater self-government were repeatedly blocked because it was feared that the Arabs were given control. If the Arabs were given control of their own affairs, they would ban further Jewish immigration. In turn, the Arabs lost faith in the British claims to impartiality. These tensions in the mandate were turned into a crisis by the influx of Jewish refugees after Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. At a point where most countries maintained strict border controls, Palestine was one of the places that Jews escaping persecution could enter fairly easily. Concerned that they would eventually be turned into a minority, Arab leaders wanted Jewish immigration to stop. Violence flared in the winter of 1935, and in April 1936, Arab workers began a well-supported general strike. During the summer, Arab guerrillas attacked Jewish settlements and cut off the oil pipeline that ran across the north to Palestine. The British responded with a tough security crackdown that embraced collective punishment, including the destruction of houses for communities that thought to be harbouring insurgents. The colonial authorities and the military disagreed about how much force could be used to repress the uprising, but as the revolt continued over the summer, the military won out. The British brought in more soldiers and threatened to introduce martial law if the strike was not brought to an end. In October 1936, a ceasefire was negotiated while the British Royal Commission considered Palestine's future. So, what does that story have to do with Singapore? What does that story have to do with Britain's aircraft industry? What it has to do with both of those things is the position that Palestine had in the overall system of imperial governance and defense. As it says there, Palestine would have been a useful staging post for troops heading towards Europe. If you take particularly troops coming from India, go across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and instead of stopping in India, where there's a cap of 10,000 on British troops, they stop in Palestine, and that was the plan. From there, you can fight in anywhere in the Mediterranean, and perhaps you can even be part of a second front in France, as Indian troops had been in World War One. So Palestine is a key part of a bigger system of imperial defense and control, and there are conflicts between domestic defense, naval and RAF domestic defense, and the European theatre, and the demands of Asia and the Middle East. All of which are part of Britain's kind of wider system of imperial defence. And Hitler and Mussolini both recognised that the British Empire was approaching a moment of critical weakness, and its size and its vulnerability, particularly at choke points like the Suez Canal and Singapore, meant that the British would at some point have to choose between fighting in Europe and fighting in Asia. And for the most part, initially, they choose to fight in Europe. Anyway, I'll leave you there. Keep an eye out for. I'm going to post in sometime this week a live link for the Germany masterclass that's coming up. So we'll be doing it. We'll be doing it now in March, and it's going to be a two-part seminar on the rise of the Nazis and about Hitler's government in power. So make sure if you're studying that for your exams this summer, make sure you check that out, and I'll be posting that in the podcast in the next few days. Take good care, everyone, and if you like this podcast and you want to listen to it advert-free, hop on over to Patreon because you can find it there. Take good care now. All the best. Bye-bye.
Few things are as uplifting as the greatest moments in sports. And nothing brings us together quite like Team USA at the Olympic Winter Games. From NBC Universal's iconic storytelling to the innovative technology across Xfinity and Peacock, Comcast brings the Olympic Games home to America, sharing every moment with millions. When Team USA steps onto the world stage, we're not just watching, we're cheering together. This winter, we're all on the same team. Comcast, proud partner of Team USA.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.